Spring 1943, Central Texas. The wind moved like a slow tide through the prairie grass, bending the earth in long sighs beneath a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon. Heat shimmered on the asphalt road leading into Camp Hearne, where new arrivals were being unloaded, tired, pale, and blinking against the light. The war was half a world away, yet its shadow had reached even here, to this quiet corner of Texas where barbed wire cut across ranchland and watchtowers stood over fields once meant for cattle. Among the prisoners was a woman in a faded Red Cross uniform, her hair pinned tightly beneath a kerchief. Her name was Anna Müller, though the guards mispronounced it, Miller, they called her. She didn't correct them. After months of being moved from one transport to another, from a field hospital in Tunisia to the belly of a Liberty ship, she had learned the futility of correction. What mattered now was silence, survival, and sunlight. She had not seen sunlight without smoke in almost a year. As the gate closed behind her, the dust rose in small storms at her feet. Inside the camp, life had its own strange order. German soldiers played chess with bottle caps. Others painted murals of Bavarian hills on the walls of their barracks, recreating home in color and memory. And now, this was the curiosity, the Americans were sending women here too. Not fighters but auxiliaries, nurses and administrators caught up in the tide of war. Few Texans believed it at first. Women? One guard had whispered. Nazis? Another had said. But the paperwork was real, the orders were signed, and so the camp made room. The air smelled of mesquite and iron. Beyond the fences, the land stretched into a quilt of dry grass and cattle pasture. Somewhere out there, men on horseback, ranchers, farmhands, cowboys, worked their daily rounds. They saw the new prisoners through heat, haze, and distance, silhouettes behind wire. To them, war was something that lived in headlines and telegrams, not in human faces. In the beginning, the camp felt like purgatory. Days ran together under the Texas sun, the sky a harsh, endless blue that made the world seem both eternal and trapped. Anna worked in the infirmary, tending to small injuries and heat exhaustion among her fellow detainees. The American medics treated her with wary respect. She was efficient, calm, and spoke English better than most. She rarely smiled. At night, when the searchlights swept the compound, she would sit by the narrow window of the women's barack and watch the glow fade across the fields. Sometimes in that half-light she could hear music, an accordion, a guitar, laughter drifting from the guards' quarters. The sound reminded her of home and hurt all the same. She thought of her brother, somewhere on the Eastern Front, perhaps already gone. She thought of the men she had treated, their hands shaking as morphine dulled the end. And she thought of the absurdity of being imprisoned in a place where wildflowers grew right up to the fence line. She didn't know it yet, but this strange exile would change her. April 1943. The war machine turned, but time in Texas slowed. The camp had become almost self-sustaining, its own village, complete with bakeries, workshops, and a small library. The prisoners were given tasks under guard, helping on nearby farms or repairing machinery. It was there, on a ranch just beyond the outer gate, that Anna first saw him. He was a ranch hand named Thomas Reeves, 27, a quiet man with sun-creased eyes and the slow patience of someone raised under wide skies. He didn't say much, even to the other Americans. But he noticed everything: the rhythm of the land, the moods of the cattle, the way storms built over the horizon before they came. On that day he noticed the group of German internees being escorted to the fields, their khaki uniforms foreign against the dust. One of them, a woman carrying a first-aid satchel, looked up as she passed. Their eyes met for only a moment. Nothing was said. Nothing could be. But it was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The narrator's voice would say, "War scatters people like seeds in the wind. Some land in ruin. Some, improbably, take root." Inside the camp, rumors drifted faster than the dust. Some guards said the Germans were treated too well. Others, veterans themselves, said that decency was a duty even toward the enemy. The Red Cross oversaw inspections, ensuring the Americans followed the Geneva rules. The prisoners were fed, clothed, and even paid small wages for their labor. To outsiders it seemed almost comfortable. But inside, every day was an act of waiting, for letters that might never come, for news from a crumbling Europe, for an end no one could predict. Anna kept her distance. Professional. Reserved. But the world beyond the wire had begun to change her rhythm. Working on the farms brought something unfamiliar. Open sky without searchlights, work without fear. And there, among Texans who still tipped their hats to strangers, she began to sense a fragile kind of peace. May 1943, heat rising early. The camp's flag snapped in the wind. Across the barbed wire, the fields burned gold under the sun. The war felt impossibly far away. Yet in letters sent home, the prisoners still wrote of duty, of return, of a Germany they might never see again. One afternoon, as Anna tended to a worker who'd cut his hand on a fence post, Thomas approached. He spoke carefully, unsure if she would understand. "You're the nurse." She nodded. "Guess I am now," she replied, her accent soft but clear. That was all. A few words traded across dust and daylight. But afterward, he found himself thinking about her. The way she moved with quiet precision, the way her eyes seemed to hold both defiance and exhaustion. He didn't know it yet, but that brief exchange would alter the rest of his life. By summer, Camp Hearne had become a microcosm of contradictions. Behind its fences, Germans built model theaters, wrote operas, and staged debates about democracy versus fascism. Some still swore allegiance to the Reich, others just wanted the war to end. Beyond the fences, Texas carried on: crops, cattle, rodeos, Sunday sermons. The two worlds existed side by side, separated by wire and ideology, yet joined by weather, soil, and the simple rhythm of work. It was in that liminal space that something impossible began, a tenderness that grew not from romance at first, but from shared humanity. When Thomas passed near the infirmary, he would nod. She would nod back. Words were dangerous, looks were safer. But in those looks, an entire language formed. She noticed his hands, scarred, rough, honest. He noticed her eyes, steady, intelligent, with a sadness that seemed older than war. If anyone had told them they would one day dance together under a Texas sky, they would have laughed. Yet history is built not on orders but on accidents. Autumn 1943. The weather cooled. Letters began to arrive, some joyous, most not. The prisoners learned of bombings in Hamburg, of families displaced, of soldiers lost. The Americans read headlines about Tarawa, Salerno, and Kasserine Pass. Both sides were bleeding, but here, in the stillness of the plains, there was only dust and wind. Anna's duties expanded. She was trusted, by now, by the camp's American medical staff. When a fever outbreak struck the farm workers, she and Thomas worked side by side for the first time, disinfecting tools, wrapping wounds, carrying water from the well. They barely spoke. They didn't need to. Each act of help, each glance, was a kind of conversation the war had never allowed. That night, as thunder rolled across the hills, she stood at the fence and watched lightning fork over the horizon. For the first time in years, she felt the ache of something other than fear. Hope, perhaps. Or belonging. In Washington, the war planners saw Texas only as a logistical solution, a place far from the front, where prisoners could be kept humanely until peace came. But history would remember something else, that even in captivity humanity found strange ways to endure. That among the barbed wire and watchtowers, there were gardens, laughter, songs, and love. The narrator's tone softens. They came as prisoners. They found work, dignity, and a kind of forgiveness neither side expected. And for a few, like Anna Müller, the fences became something more than confinement. They became the boundaries of a new beginning. As winter approached, the camp prepared for another year. Soldiers rotated home or overseas. Prisoners aged, waiting for letters that might never arrive. But somewhere in that expanse of sun-bleached wood and wire, two hearts had already crossed a border no treaty could define. The story was only beginning. And though neither of them knew it yet, what started as a duty born of war would become a love that outlasted the peace. Escalation. Spring 1944, Camp Hearne, Texas. The sun returned early that year, rising hard and white over the plains. By March, the mesquite already carried the smell of dust and sap, and the prairie dogs vanished into the cracked earth. Inside Camp Hearne, routine pressed on with the quiet weight of ritual: roll call, work detail, evening count, lights out. The war in Europe thundered far away, but the noise of it arrived in fragments. A radio headline in the guard tower, a new map pinned inside the administration office showing red arrows pushing toward France. For Anna Müller, those arrows carried everything she could not say aloud. Each one moved closer to a home that no longer existed as she remembered it. She still wrote letters, to a mother she feared was gone, to a brother missing in Russia, but the answers rarely came. When they did, they were written in careful, measured lines, every sentence blurred by the censor's black ink. Her work in the infirmary gave her structure. She cleaned wounds from the sawmill detail, counted quinine tablets, taught orderlies to boil their instruments twice. The Americans had come to rely on her quiet efficiency. They called her Nurse Anna, not Prisoner Müller, and though the difference seemed small, it changed the air around her. Each week, she accompanied a medical truck beyond the wire to tend workers on the nearby ranches. It was a privilege granted sparingly, but her record was spotless, and the Red Cross inspectors praised her discipline. The guards watched her closely the first few trips. Then they stopped. She had become, to them, part of the machine that kept the camp alive. That was how Thomas Reeves came back into her orbit. The drought had driven local ranchers to accept POW labor under government contract. Reeves oversaw the work crews, repairing fences, loading hay, clearing brush. When the truck pulled in, Anna stepped down with her satchel, sunlight catching the pale fabric of her cap. The men deferred to her now, even the Americans. Reeves noticed it, and with it, something else, a quiet authority born not of rank but of endurance. Their conversations began as necessity: how many men had collapsed from heat, how deep the water trough should be dug. Then, slowly, it turned into something human. He asked about the Alps. She asked about the cattle drives. Words bridged a distance that rules had built. Every letter of military law forbade such familiarity, but the frontier had its own gravity. There were too few people, too much open sky, and the loneliness between one fence post and the next could swallow a man whole. Reeves began to look for excuses to assign her work near his crew. She began to dread the days when the truck did not leave the gate. Inside the camp, gossip grew like kudzu. Other prisoners whispered that she was going soft, that the Americans had bought her kindness. A guard joked that the Lady Kraut nurse had tamed the hardest cowboy in Texas. She ignored them both. But at night, when the generator hummed to silence, she wondered if compassion itself was betrayal. May 1944, the firebreak. That spring a brush fire swept through the outer fields. Dry wind carried sparks across half a mile of fence before the alarms rang. Prisoners and guards ran together with buckets and wet burlap, shouting in both languages. The smoke turned the evening copper red. Somewhere in the chaos, a stack of fuel drums ignited. The blast knocked 2 men flat. Reeves was one of them. Anna reached him before the medic truck did. His sleeve was burned through, skin blistered raw beneath. She tore strips from her skirt hem, wrapped the wound, pressed cool water from her canteen. For a moment there was no war, only smoke, heat, and the frantic pulse of someone refusing to let another die. When the officers arrived, they saw her leaning over an American civilian, hands stained with soot. She expected punishment for leaving her assigned post. Instead, the camp commander wrote a commendation. "Quick action under duress," he said. "Professional conduct." But rules remained rules. She was confined to barracks for 2 weeks, for appearance's sake, the lieutenant explained. Reeves sent a note through a sympathetic guard. "Thank you for the fire. I'd be dust without you." She read it once, folded it into her diary, and hid it under her mattress. Summer 1944, widening circles. By June, talk of invasion filled the camp. D-Day. Normandy. Liberation. The German prisoners argued in low voices at night, some triumphant, others hollow-eyed. Anna said nothing. She had seen enough broken men to know victory was another word for grief delayed. The infirmary overflowed with heat exhaustion cases. The Americans requisitioned local ice, packed it into galvanized tubs, and ordered the prisoners to soak their arms. Reeves appeared again, his arms still bandaged but healing. He thanked her formally this time in front of others. She nodded, careful to keep her expression neutral. Later that week, when he passed near the outer fence, he left a small bundle of wildflowers wedged in the wire, sunflowers and Indian paintbrush. No note. Just color against the rusted steel. She didn't dare take them inside, but she stood there a long time, watching the petals turn in the wind. Every act of kindness was a kind of defiance. Every glance a risk. And yet the risk itself began to feel like freedom. Autumn 1944. Cracks in the wall. The U.S. military tightened regulations that fall. Too many fraternization reports from other camps. Too many blurred lines. Mixed work details were suspended. Anna was reassigned to the camp hospital full-time, no longer permitted outside the fence. Reeves rode by once, hat-tipped, pretending to check a fence line. That night she found a note slipped under a supply crate. "I'll be nearby when the harvest starts. Don't forget the open sky." Weeks passed without sight of him. Rumors said he'd been drafted for stateside logistics. Others claimed he'd joined a supply convoy bound for Europe. Each version hollowed her chest a little more. Then in October, the camp received orders to expand the infirmary into a full-time hospital for incoming Italian prisoners. Anna threw herself into the work. She sterilized instruments until her fingers cracked. She translated medical charts, trained assistants, slept 4 hours a night. Purpose dulled the ache of absence. But one morning as she walked across the compound with a stack of reports, she heard a whistle, 3 short notes, 1 long. It was the sound cowhands used to call horses. She turned. Through the wire, beyond the guard line, a man on horseback raised his hat. Even at distance, she recognized the tilt of his shoulders. Reeves. He had come back. Winter 1944, the divide. The war's last winter settled heavy over Texas. The plains froze at dawn, thawed by noon, froze again by dusk. The prisoners carved stoves from oil drums, burning mesquite to keep warm. Rumors of Germany's collapse reached even them. Aachen, the Ardennes, the Red Army pushing west. Some cheered, others wept. For Anna it was both ending and erasure. She no longer knew which homeland the word home described. She saw Reeves only at distance, but the sight of him anchored her against the blur of days. Once, during a Red Cross inspection, he managed to hand her a folded photograph. His family's ranch, his dog, a field of bluebonnets stretching to the horizon. On the back, a single line. If you ever see this land without fences, remember you have a place in it. That night, she hid the photo inside the hollow of her medical ledger, beneath the entry for quinine. Her heart beat so loud she thought the guards could hear it. Texas, 1944. The war was half a world away, but the wind that rolled over the prairie still carried its echo. Heat shimmered over the barbed wire fences of Camp Hearne, where time itself seemed suspended between 2 worlds, one of red dust and wide skies, the other of ghosts left behind in a bomb-scarred Europe. For the men and women inside those fences, each sunrise was both a reminder and a reprieve. Among them walked Anna Müller, a former nurse of the German Red Cross. Her hands, once trained to bind wounds on the Eastern Front, now tended to blisters, fevers, and broken bones beneath the Texan sun. The uniform was different now, khaki instead of gray, but the smell of iodine and sweat was the same. Her mission was simple: assist in the camp infirmary, support the American medics, and maintain discipline among the women's ward. Her obstacle was far greater: language, mistrust, and the invisible weight of her uniform's memory. The guards called her Fräulein, some kindly, some not. The civilians beyond the wire saw her as both enemy and curiosity, a reminder that even here on American soil the war's reach was endless. But to Thomas Reed, a rancher-turned-corporal assigned to supervise the medical work detail, Anna was something else entirely, a contradiction he could not look away from. Escalation. It began with silence. Thomas had first seen her one morning as the infirmary doors creaked open, sunlight spilling across the wooden floors. She moved with the precision of someone who understood suffering, quiet, measured, almost reverent. Her English was fragmented, her accent thick, but her meaning was clear in every motion. When a sick prisoner trembled from malaria, she steadied his hand. When an American nurse muttered, "Enemy," Anna lowered her eyes not in shame but in endurance. Outside, Texas burned in the summer of '44. The POW labor program sent prisoners to local farms, rail lines, and sawmills. Barbed wire gave way to open fields, and soon war's boundaries blurred. German prisoners harvested cotton, built barns, and earned pennies that meant little but dignity. The townspeople began to see them not as monsters but as men, young, scared, and tired. Anna watched this transformation with something between wonder and guilt. She had tended wounded Americans once, quietly, under orders, when the Red Cross still clung to neutrality. But this was different. These were the enemy's faces in the flesh, and yet they bled the same, coughed the same, prayed the same. Thomas noticed the way she lingered at the gate after each shift, gazing toward the open plains. "That's what freedom looks like," he once said softly. She didn't answer, just looked at him with the faintest, cautious smile. Their connection was wordless at first. A shared glance over a wounded worker. A translation offered when her English faltered. A cup of coffee, slipped discreetly to her when the night shift stretched too long. The conflict between duty and feeling crept in like smoke. She had been raised in a world of loyalty, to flag, to family, to the nurses who still believed the Reich would last 1,000 years. But in Texas the Reich was a rumor. Here, under the endless sky, humanity felt older than nations. Confrontation. Autumn came, and with it the long drought. The infirmary filled with men, not from battle but from the land itself. Heat exhaustion, snakebite, malnutrition. The farmers were stretched thin. Even the POWs were sent to dig irrigation ditches. One day, a group was dispatched to Thomas's family ranch, 100 acres of dust and dying cattle. Anna was assigned as medical support, an experimental privilege meant to test her reliability outside the camp. She arrived at dawn, escorted by a single guard, her Red Cross armband faded to pink. Thomas met her at the fence line. "You'll help with first aid," he told her, trying to sound official. But both knew it was something else, a fragile trust between two people on opposite sides of history. For 3 weeks they worked in the heat. She treated blisters and sunstroke, wrapped hands rubbed raw by shovels. He brought her canteens of cool water, taught her English phrases she practiced shyly: clouds, thunder, freedom. In return she taught him Himmel, heaven, and how to say stay strong in German. The boundary between prisoner and guard thinned until it was only memory. One afternoon, a farmhand collapsed in the field. The guard was nowhere in sight. Thomas shouted for help, and Anna ran across the invisible line that marked the edge of her permitted zone. She knelt beside the man, pressed her ear to his chest, and began compressions, her hands firm and practiced. When the guard returned, he saw only a German woman kneeling beside an American, outside her boundary, her hands stained with his sweat and blood. The report was filed by sundown. Violation of proximity protocol. Unauthorized medical assistance. Possible fraternization. For Anna, it was a betrayal of trust she hadn't known she still feared. The camp commandant summoned her the next morning. She stood at attention, palms trembling. Across the desk, Thomas faced his own interrogation. His commanding officer's words were precise, venomous. "You forgot which side you're on, Corporal?" He could have denied it, said it was all procedure, that she acted under orders. Instead he said the one thing that sealed them both. She saved a man's life. The silence that followed was colder than any battlefield. They were separated. She returned to confinement, stripped of infirmary duty. He reassigned to supply work. For weeks neither spoke. But every evening, Anna could see the silhouette of the ranch on the horizon, the windmill turning slow against the sunset, and she thought of him. In her bunk, she whispered the words he had taught her: "Stay strong." Inside his tent, Thomas traced her name in the dust on his desk. The war still raged overseas, Normandy, Arnhem, the Ardennes, but for them the conflict had moved inward. It was no longer about nations or orders, but about the unbearable knowledge that even in war, kindness could feel like treason. Resolution. Winter came late to Texas. In Europe, the war was ending, cities falling, camps liberated, flags lowered. At Camp Hearne, rumors drifted like dry leaves. Germany was collapsing. Surrender was inevitable. One morning the repatriation orders arrived. Prisoners were to be processed for return. Some cheered. Others wept. A few, quietly, were terrified, for what awaited them was not home but ruins. Anna's name was on the list. She folded the paper in her hands and stared at it for a long time. Around her, women packed their few belongings: letters, trinkets, pieces of the life they'd built behind the wire. But she hesitated. For her, home had already shifted. It now smelled of mesquite and coffee, of horses and dust and freedom's far horizon. That evening, Thomas appeared at the fence for the first time in months. He wasn't supposed to be there. He brought no weapon, no uniform markings, only a small paper parcel. Inside, a single photograph: a field at sunset, the windmill in silhouette. On the back he had written 3 words: "You are free." They didn't speak. They didn't touch. Just silence between them, heavy, eternal, sacred. She wanted to tell him that she no longer dreamed of Berlin, that the sound of cicadas had replaced the sirens of war. But words failed, swallowed by the moment. The next morning, as the trucks idled by the gate, Anna stood with her suitcase. Her heart pounded with a decision that defied everything she had been taught. Around her, the others boarded, their faces pale with uncertainty. The guard called her name twice. She didn't move. Instead, she turned away, toward the infirmary, toward the sound of wind through the cotton fields. She walked until the camp shrank behind her, until the fences were just a memory. Somewhere beyond, Thomas waited, unsure if she'd come. When she appeared at the edge of the road, he said nothing, just tipped his hat, eyes wet with disbelief. For a moment the world stood still. No gunfire. No orders. No nations. Only 2 souls caught between what was forbidden and what was right. She stayed. The POW assimilation programs in the American South were one of history's quiet ironies. By 1945, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners lived on U.S. soil. Many worked in agriculture, aiding local economies while the nation's men fought overseas. Records show that some, a few dozen, chose to remain after the war, marrying American citizens or seeking civilian visas once released. Their decisions were often met with suspicion, sometimes hostility. But over time, the memory softened into local legend. The prisoners who came as enemies and stayed as neighbors. Anna Müller was one of them. Her name appears in post-war immigration archives under a new line of occupation: Nurse, domestic worker, naturalized 1948. The camp she left behind was dismantled, its fences torn down, its barracks turned into barns. Today, wildflowers grow where the guard towers once stood. She came as a prisoner. She left as something else, not free by papers or politics, but by the quiet act of choosing compassion over loyalty. History rarely remembers such choices. It remembers the battles, not the waiting, the generals, not the nurses. But somewhere in the Texas wind, her story endures, a fragment of mercy carried through the years. For every soldier who fought to destroy, there was another who fought simply to heal. And sometimes, the smallest rebellion is to love where you were told to hate. What she didn't know that morning in 1943 when she first crossed the ocean in chains, was that her war would end not with surrender, but with forgiveness. And long after the headlines faded, the prairie kept its secret. That one of history's fiercest enemies found peace not in victory, but in the simple, stubborn grace of staying. The legacy. History remembers the wars that men start but not always the peace that women build. By the time the world began to rebuild in 1946, the fences at Camp Hearne were rusting in the Texas wind. The guards had gone home, the sentry towers dismantled plank by plank. Only the faint lines in the soil showed where the wire once cut the earth. But the memory of those years, of prisoners, guards and unlikely friendships, lingered like heat after a storm. Anna Müller was one of the last to leave the camp. Except she never truly left. Aftermath. The historical outcome of that time was monumental. Germany lay in ruins, its cities blackened, its people displaced, its soldiers lost in surrender. The Allies declared victory, but for many, peace came with silence rather than celebration. Across Europe, families searched the rubble for names on lists. Across America, the victory banners came down, and life tried to begin again. In Texas, the war's shadow softened into routine. The POW camps became farms, their barracks repurposed for migrant workers and livestock. Few spoke of the Germans who had once labored there, or of the rare whispered stories of love that defied the laws of war. But in a small farmhouse just outside Hearne, one such story endured. Anna lived quietly at first, a nurse without a country, a woman suspended between guilt and grace. Her English improved, her accent fading into the rhythm of the plains. She volunteered at a local clinic, where mothers came with their children and veterans came with their pain. To most, she was simply Miss Anna, the kind nurse with foreign manners and hands that never shook. To Thomas Reed, she was home itself, though their love, even in peace, was met with wary eyes. Some neighbors refused to speak to them. Others called her the Nazi nurse. But over time, anger gave way to curiosity and curiosity to acceptance. When drought hit again in 47, it was Anna who organized the aid drive, rationing medical supplies and food for families too proud to ask for help. In a land that once saw her as the enemy, she became a healer once more. Personal resolution. Thomas and Anna married in the spring of 1948, quietly, without ceremony. No uniforms, no flags, just two witnesses and the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. In her vows, she spoke halting English, "I was not meant to be here, but I am." He answered softly, "You are exactly where you're meant to be." They built a life measured not in grandeur but in endurance. He returned to ranching, she worked as the town nurse. When her first child was born, a daughter named Elise, Anna wept not for joy alone but for memory. Somewhere across the ocean her homeland was rebuilding from ashes. She would never see it again. For years she kept a small box beneath her bed. Inside, her Red Cross armband, a faded photograph of Berlin before the war, and a single letter from her mother, dated 1942. On the back, in trembling German script, the last word she ever read from home, "Bleib menschlich." Stay human. That became her creed. Her quiet defiance against everything the war had demanded of her. Historical reflection. By the 1950s, most Americans had forgotten the existence of the POW assimilation program. The government records were sealed, the barracks dismantled, the fields repurposed. But a few historians, and even fewer locals, remembered. They remembered how prisoners once worked side by side with farmers, picking cotton under the same sun. How some had returned home speaking English, carrying American manners back to their broken towns. And how a handful, men and women like Anna, had chosen to stay, unable to return to a country that no longer felt like theirs. It's easy looking back to dismiss such stories as rumor. But history is built as much on rumor as on record. What mattered was not the paperwork but the legacy, the idea that even in a world divided by ideology, empathy could cross a battlefield. When Anna's name appeared in the 1948 naturalization records, it was surrounded by others, Italian, Japanese, German, all seeking the same thing, not citizenship but belonging. For Anna, that small line in a government ledger was the final proof that she had survived more than war. She had survived hate itself. Moral insight. In interviews decades later, veterans of the Texas Guard spoke of how the camp changed them. One, an old sergeant with a rasping voice, said, "We were told to watch the Germans. Never thought I'd end up learning from one." He never named her. You didn't have to. That was Anna's legacy, quiet, invisible, lasting. No medals. No parades. Just the slow, unremarkable miracle of forgiveness lived day by day. Some people measure victory by conquest. Others by survival. But for Anna Müller, victory was something smaller. The courage to remain kind when the world no longer rewarded kindness. The weight of memory. When Thomas passed away in 1971, Anna buried him on the hill overlooking the old ranch, the same ground where the POW detail once dug trenches 30 years before. She planted wildflowers around the grave and sat beside it every evening at sunset, watching the windmill turn. Neighbors say she spoke little in her final years. But sometimes when the wind was right, they could hear her humming an old German lullaby. She died in 1983, the same year the Camp Hearne Historical Society formed to preserve what was left of the site. Volunteers found her name on a roster tucked in the archives. Müller, Anna, medical detail, and added it to a small plaque dedicated to the camp's medical staff. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. But if you stop, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the faint clang of the mess hall, the hum of cicadas, and the soft voice of a nurse who came as a prisoner and stayed as a citizen. Legacy statement. The legacy of Anna Müller is not written in textbooks. It lives in the oral histories of Hearne, in the stories told by ranch families, in the clinics she helped build, in the quiet respect that replaced suspicion over time. Her children grew up bilingual. Her daughter became a teacher, her son a medic in Vietnam. When asked why he enlisted, he once answered simply, "My mother taught me that healing is another kind of courage." And perhaps that's what her story was always about, moral courage. The kind that does not fight with guns or flags, but with endurance, with mercy, with love that asks for nothing in return. In a century defined by destruction, Anna Müller's small act of staying, of choosing humanity over homeland, became a rebellion all its own. Some wars are fought with bullets. Others are fought in the silence that follows them. She didn't win a battle. She didn't raise a flag. She simply stayed, a quiet act of resistance against everything the world had told her to be. When people ask how enemies become neighbors, they tell stories of treaties and borders. But the truth lies elsewhere, in the hands that heal, the fields shared under sun, the moment when one human being looks at another and refuses to see an enemy. Anna Müller's story is a whisper inside the roar of history, a reminder that peace is not declared, it is chosen. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay where you are, unarmed and unafraid, and love the life that once was forbidden to you. Some men fight. Some command. Some remember. But a very few choose to heal. And in doing so, they change the world quietly, one heartbeat at a time. The windmill still turns on the hill above Hearne. Its blades catch the same wind that once carried the sounds of war, now softened into peace. And somewhere in that wind, between the creak of rusted metal and the call of distant cattle, you can almost hear her voice, calm, steady, eternal, whispering the same words that once crossed a battlefield and built a home. Bleib menschlich. Stay human.